I've experienced a lot of betrayal in my life, and maybe you have too. It includes personal betrayal, friends who've turned on me, professional betrayal. Remember, there was a Chinese partner, one of the few Chinese partners, one of the few Chinese bosses I've had in my entire life, who I thought was an ally and maybe even a friend, who ended up basically turning on me and trying to get me fired at my job in Palo Alto when I first moved out to the Bay Area as a corporate lawyer. And I've seen activism betrayal too. I'm recording this podcast almost exactly 1 year after I was sentenced to 90 days in prison, convicted of 2 felonies in a case involving the mass open rescue of 37 hens from a Sonoma County factory farm. And one of the reasons that's what happened in the case is because some of the activists who are working on the case turned on us, turned on me. And there are a lot of things to learn about betrayal, but one of the things that makes betrayal most hard is when you're betrayed by the people who you seek out to protect you, the people you think are defending you. And that certainly happened to me, where among a group of co-defendants, there are people who turn on us. There's a member of our legal team, in fact, a point person on a legal team that was supposedly defending me, that I had entrusted, who ended up turning on me and stabbing me in the back. And honestly, I'm not entirely recovered from that. I'm still sort of relearning how to trust people after that experience. But the fact that betrayal is most awful and disgusting and monstrous when you're betrayed by the people you trust the most is one of the reasons I wanted to make this YouTube show about this phenomenon called the Judas Sheep. So if you don't know what the Judas Sheep are, there was an undercover investigation executed by Direct Action Everywhere at a slaughterhouse in Denver called Superior Farms. It was released a couple weeks ago, shortly before Denver voters will vote on whether slaughterhouses in Denver should be banned. But they found all sorts of disgusting and awful things, including animals being eviscerated alive, animals with broken legs being kicked in the face, animals with their internal organs literally hanging outside of their own bodies while they're still conscious and awake. But I have to say, the thing that probably troubled and disturbed me the most of all the things they found was this practice called the Judas Sheep. What is the Judas Sheep? The Judas Sheep are a set of sheep who are the rare animals in a slaughterhouse who will not be killed because they're taught to betray the other sheep. They're given treats and pets. Sometimes they're given cigarettes because apparently sheep are prone to addiction. And so you can basically manipulate a sheep by getting them addicted to cigarettes and then denying them access to tobacco, except when they do what you want them to do. And what is it that the slaughterhouse wants these Judas sheep to do? Well, the slaughterhouse wants them to betray the other sheep by leading them to slaughter. And in particular, the Judas sheep are adult sheep who live at the slaughterhouse in separate and special pens. They get special privileges that the other sheep do not. Most importantly, the privilege to live. But when the other lambs arrive at the slaughterhouse, and this is a facility that kills, I think, 5,000 lambs. I think it's every week. I don't remember the exact numbers. Is that right? So it's 5,000 a week sounds about right, because I think it's 250 to 500,000 a year. So 5,000 a week would be roughly 250,000 a year. But when these lambs arrive at the slaughterhouse at Superior Farms, they're terrified. These are highly social animals. These are prey animals that have a lot of fear. When you look at some of the research that's been done on sheep, it's kind of amazing how they take cues from the flock. They can read each other's faces. They can read each other's body language. And when you see other sheep with their ears pressed against their head in the same way a dog might get scared, cower and press their ears against the head, an entire flock of sheep will react in that fashion when they see one that's afraid. And when they arrive at the slaughterhouse, not only do they see the fear in the other lambs, but they smell it. They can feel it, because this is a place that's filled with death and blood and decomposing bodies. And so they're scared. And because they're scared, like most people are scared of some scary place, they don't want to walk openly and voluntarily into the facility. But there's one thing about sheep and most baby mammals that the slaughterhouse can exploit to overcome this fear and induce the sheep and lambs to gladly walk to their own slaughter. And that is their need for protection. You see, sheep, like a lot of mammals, when they're babies, they look to adults for companionship and for support and for protection. And when they see an adult that seems kind and seems willing to protect them, they will follow them. And that's what the Judas sheep do. They're trained to go into the slaughter trucks, go into slaughter pens, rally the other sheep, in this case, little lambs, who are much smaller than the Judas sheep, and then walk with them to the place where they'll be electrocuted and have their throats slit. And you can see some of the footage in the Intercept article that was published along with the DXE investigation. It's incredibly disturbing. And I'm also going to release some separate footage in the Substack newsletter that I send out that accompanies this podcast. But it's grim and disturbing shit. And yeah, I mean, honestly, I've been haunted by some of the things I've seen, and just the idea that these adult lambs, these adult sheep, are taking children to slaughter. And that's embedded in the system. It's commonly done at slaughterhouses across the nation that are slaughtering sheep and goats. But the point of this YouTube show and podcast is not just to horrify you about one of the many horrifying practices within animal agriculture, but to point out that there is a broader problem. See, the Judas sheep phenomenon is not confined to the walls of Superior Farms. It actually exists in our entire political system. And the argument I want to make in this show is that the concept of Judas sheep is a pretty accurate description of the American political system. Because Americans, like the lambs being led to slaughter, are being guided by our political leaders down a path to self-destruction. And it's all being done under the guise of trying to protect our interests. So take climate change. For those who don't remember, we just experienced the hottest summer in recorded history on the planet Earth. Yet both major political parties in the United States, including the party that claims to care about the environment, that claims to care about future generations, have acted as if climate change has just been completely forgotten. A couple of years ago, we were seeing climate disobedience, Extinction Rebellion, Standing Rock, and suddenly it's like climate change is no longer an issue. Instead, both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are fighting with one another for the mantle of being most pro-fossil fuel, the most pro-fracking candidate. And it's all because they're trying to secure political power, because they think they cannot win Pennsylvania, a key swing state, unless they have the power and wealth and support of the oil and fossil fuel industries. And this just comes despite the fact that well over 50% of the public actually opposes the practice of fracking. I'm reminded of the day in 2020 when I opened the door of my apartment in Berkeley and saw the sky had just turned red. It was eerie and almost blood tinted. And it was a powerful demonstration of where our planet's going unless we change course. And yet, despite that warning just a few years ago, despite the overwhelming scientific consensus that climate change, including animal agriculture, and the contribution of the livestock industry to climate change is an existential threat, our politicians are fighting with one another for the title of being more pro-fossil fuel. This is an example of the Judas sheep phenomenon. We have politicians saying they want to help us, but leading us down the path to self-destruction. But climate change, frankly, is just one of many issues where our political leaders are deceptively taking us down the path to our own nations, civilizations, maybe species' demise. On housing, I've talked previously about the fact that 1/2 of all renters in this country today are rent burdened. Food and food safety. We have a food system that is the leading cause of preventable death, that is spreading dangerous diseases all over the nation. And politicians, while they love to talk about how everybody has a right to a home, the right to food and safety, they're not providing that. In fact, they're doing exactly the opposite on behalf of the interest of the most powerful people and corporations in this country. And this is, again, the phenomenon of the Judas sheep. a leader who you think is trying to help you, but instead is taking you to self-destruction. I could list so many other examples of this, but I want to get to the point of this show, which is what can be done about this problem, the Judas Sheep. Well, the first thing that can be done is just awareness. I've talked to so many people, and I'm going to apologize ahead of time if any of you are offended because you're one of these people, who swear allegiance to one party or the other, who think that Kamala Harris of the Democratic Party, or frankly, Donald Trump and the Republican Party, are going to save us from our nation's sins, or at least are the lesser of two evils in a broken system. In neither case, that belief is profoundly misplaced, because if you look at the actual evidence and data over the last 40 to 50 years, as power has increasingly become concentrated politically, economically, socially in the hands of a small number of people, both political parties have acted like the Judas sheep. And you can just look at the results of the policies they've enacted over the last 40 to 50 years to see why. There's this amazing chart of productivity growth over the last 40 years. And I might put in the show notes the link to this chart, which I've seen many times. And it shows the productivity of our economy, which essentially is demonstrating how much wealth has been accumulated. And seen just like an incredible increase in how productive the American economy is and how productive each individual worker is. So, and generally through most of the history of the United States, when productivity grows, when the pie is getting bigger, when we become more productive as individual workers and laborers, our wages go up, right? But in fact, while you've seen a massive increase in productivity of workers, you've seen almost no increase in wages over that same period, with one very important exception. Over the last 40 years, we have seen one category of Americans experience skyrocketing wage growth, and that is the ultra wealthy, the top 5% of Americans, and especially the top 1%. I've said before, and I think this is still true today, that 3 Americans, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos, control more wealth than the bottom 50% of Americans combined. So at every level of economic elitism, whether it's the top 5%, the top 1%, or even just the top 3 most wealthy people in America, you see an even more skewed wealth distribution. And in fact, if you look over the past 40 or so years since 1980, those in the top 5% have seen 41% wage growth. The median worker has basically seen no wage growth at all. And low wage workers have actually seen decreases in wages in real terms. So real terms just means actual purchasing power, because inflation makes every year the dollar be worth in real terms a little less. All of us have seen prices for gas and food and everything else go up. And so when prices go up, even if your wages go up, you don't have the same purchasing power. And so when we scale wages for actual purchasing power, for real growth, the median American has seen almost no growth at all, basically no growth. And the lowest wage folks have seen decreases. But here's an important point. It's not just Americans that are experiencing this. The economist Thomas Piketty wrote this amazing book called Capital in the 21st Century, showing that we are seeing similar trends in developed nations across the globe. Wealth is increasing, wages are not. So then you might ask the question, well, doesn't the answer lie in democracy, or at least a better functioning democracy? Suppose we got rid of corporate contributions to campaigns and elections. Suppose we got rid of things like the Electoral College, which are counter-majoritarian, or the filibuster, which prevents majorities from enacting their will in the United States. There are any number of minor, in some cases quite major, revisions to the practice of democracy in this country and in other countries that maybe would align our political leaders more with ordinary people, would prevent the phenomenon of the Judas sheep, deceptive politicians pretending to act on behalf of the people, but actually undermining our interests. So while that is a tempting answer, and it's part of the answer to the solution of the Judas sheep, it's not a complete answer. In fact, it's far from a complete answer. Because the problem with the Judas sheep is not just that we have poor structures. It's not just that the Electoral College is not majoritarian. The Electoral College is a system by which we elect presidents of the United States, and it's not based on a majority of voters. It's a convoluted system based on bargaining that happened in 1776. The problem is not just structures like the filibuster that require in the US Senate 60% of senators to support legislation before it's passed. Now, the problem is more fundamental than the structures. The problem is the values. Because no matter what structures you have, if the values or goals that you're trying to achieve with those structures are themselves bad, then the structures are relevant. And in fact, we've seen this across not just the nation, but the globe, because you have many countries where campaign contributions by corporations are banned. They're still dealing with the problem of the Judas Sheep. You have many countries where you don't have a filibuster or an electoral college, that the structures of democracy are very aligned with the will of the people, and yet they're still facing the problem of the Judas Sheep. So the problem is not just structures, it is values. And what I mean by that is no matter what structures you have, if you have values, if you have cultural norms, if you have ideologies that animate the public and animate the systems under which the political system is operating in a way that exclude certain individuals, then inevitably you will have a problem with the Judas Sheep. In other words, if a slaughterhouse, for example, took into account the feelings of all the sentient beings in that slaughterhouse, there's no way in hell anyone would train sheep to become Judas sheep, because they think about the lambs being slaughtered, the fear, the deception, the betrayal, and they say, oh, this isn't so good. You know, when we start taking into account the interest of the lambs, this practice seems kind of messed up. Or even if they looked at the interest of the Judas sheep themselves, you know, these poor animals who are being coerced to betray their fellow sheep, who are addicted to cigarettes, literally just being fed cigarettes, and live in these atrocious conditions as these like little Benedict Arnolds to their own species. If you took into account their interests, if your values were inclusive enough that the lambs and the sheep actually mattered, then you would never even consider, you would never even conceive of having something like the Judas sheep. In contrast, no matter what structures you have in place, even if you have the most effective governance system, the most democratic governance system at an organization or corporation like Superior Farms, if you're excluding a large number of the individuals, in the case of Superior Farms, 5,000 individuals at least every week who are slaughtered at the facility, do not have their interests considered at all, it's not within the value set of Superior Farms, then even the most effective union, even the most democratic governance structure within the corporation would still lead to horrible outcomes like the Judas sheep. Because after all, if you're not considering the interest of the lambs, then why not deceive them? Why not lead them to slaughter? Why not betray them? Because their interests don't matter. And so what that means is fundamentally, if the problem in not just American, but human society is a values problem, namely that we think that there are some individuals who matter, some individuals who do not. And as a result, our political system and our political leaders will manipulate those individuals who do not matter, will harm those individuals who do not matter for the sake of the powerful who do matter. Then we can't just change our structures. We have to change what are called our terminal values. Terminal values are sort of the North Star of our entire species, of our entire nation, of each of us as individuals. And the interesting thing is, to solve the problem of the Judas sheep with respect to climate change or housing or food and food insecurity, we really have to solve the problem of animal rights. Because the problem of animal rights is that problem of inclusion. Are we taking into account everyone's interests when we decide what to do? Are we hearing everyone's cries when we decide if a particular action is one that's moral or immoral? And if we're not including everyone, then inevitably we will see Judas sheep develop. So I think the specific implication I want to bring up here is in some ways even more dramatic than the example or concept of the Judas sheep, which is that we have to radically depart from the faith in our current elected leaders, faith in our current system, and reinvest in a different set of values, a different set of structures, and a different set of people too, if we're actually going to solve the problem of our society going off the cliff. And whether it's preserving democracy, maintaining our planet's ecological health in the face of a climate crisis where we're seeing more and more positive feedback loops. And a positive feedback loop is not actually positive. A positive feedback loop is just a loop that is, it's kind of like a microphone to a speaker that creates this feedback loop that gets stronger and stronger to the point that it's erupting in a sound that's incomprehensible and unbearable for anyone who listens to the speaker. Right? We're seeing so many positive feedback loops in our ecology with respect to habitat loss, deoxygenation of oceans, rising ocean levels because of melting glaciers and icebergs and Arctic sea ice, that we need a radical departure from the values, from the structures, and the people who have been taking not just the planet, but the human species off a cliff. And so what I want to suggest to all of you who are very invested in this election, and I have to confess that I'm watching the election too. I'm checking Nate Silver's Twitter and looking at 538 and checking Polymarket, the betting market that predicts who's going to win the election. And it's almost like theater entertainment, but religiously checking all these platforms to see who's going to win. But when I actually think seriously about what's going to matter for the future of human civilization, the future of this planet, when I think seriously about what's actually going to prevent this profound betrayal that all of us are experiencing in this political system, it's not Trump or Harris. It's not the national election. It's really not elections at all. It's you and me. We've got to find a different way. We've got to find different values, and we have to spread those values through our culture, our society, our species before it's too late. And there are a lot of ways to do this, obviously. I'm not going to claim to know all the answers to the problem of how to spread these values. But the most important one is to find your voice. Because if we don't find our voice, nothing else is going to matter. And there are a lot of threats and obstacles to finding our voice and speaking for a more inclusive value system, for one that accounts for even the most vulnerable and powerless beings on this earth. But one of the big ones is just conformity. We talk about the things everyone else is talking about. And whether it's journalists who won't write about animals, politicians who won't listen when we tell them that dogs are being tortured at Ridgeland Farms, or even the ordinary person on the street who's more interested in Donald Trump and Kamala Harris than the billions of animals being tortured in factory farms. All of us need to find our voice and be willing to assert ourselves, even when no one else is talking about this issue. In fact, that is the most important time to talk about this issue, when no one else is talking about it, because that is when your voice will be distinctly needed and powerful. So that's the show for today. We've got some big stuff coming out in the next few weeks about Trump, about politics, about Big Ag. I'm going to have a great conversation with Vegan Gains' Richard Burgess early next week on a similar subject. I'm going to be arguing about Trump. So if you want to hear, not so much a pro and a con, because I don't think I would consider myself even remotely pro-Trump. I just am less concerned about Trump relative to the other choices, Kamala Harris, or frankly, even Jill Stein or Cornel West than most of the people I know. But I'm very interested to hear your thoughts. So leave a comment on Apple Podcast, on YouTube, wherever you listen to this show, and let's start some conversations about how we can solve the problem of the Judas Sheep. All right, until next time. Thanks, everyone. We don't have to hurt animals. We can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them. And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.